Cover crops might be giving off more greenhouse gases than bare ground. It's a surprise, for sure. It all comes down to how long they sit in cool and wet conditions. They pull up and hold onto more nitrogen than bare ground. However, when they die, they can give off much greater nitrous oxide emissions compared to a bare field. So check out the episode description for the summaries and read any of the most interesting articles that you see. So in case you're new here, let me introduce myself. I'm an author and independent agronomist from the Western Canadian prairies, specializing in climate-smart agriculture. I focus on scientifically proven practices to benefit the planet and, just as importantly, farmers' economic sustainability. So be sure to visit my website, www.plantsdigsoil.com, to learn about my book, Practical Regeneration, and for services that I offer for farmers and agribusiness. So how was your season this year? And do you think you could have done better? Fall is a perfect time to start working together. We still have time to plan soil sampling and analyze the results to evaluate this year's performance. I'm knowledgeable about all the funding programs available to growers in Alberta and beyond. So if you're considering new practices, we may be able to cover those costs and even include them in my consulting fees in your application. So contact me today and get on my list of growers for 2025. So I'm going to start out this monthly newsletter with the podcast episode that I made last month called Tight Soils, Sodacity, Salinity, and Alkali Explained. Now, white patches in a field are often referred to as alkali patches. The underlying problem may not be high pH. The underlying problem may be high pH, alkalinity, but salt in and of itself is not high pH and is therefore not alkaline. When you see salt on the surface, it's more properly called salinity. The reason for this is that alkalinity may or may not be there. If present, it may be near the surface or it may be deeper down. Now, compounding on this, alkalinity may not be present. Excess sodium cations, not excess sodium salts, could be the cause. And finally, just because you don't see salt on the surface doesn't mean salinity is not the problem. Regular soil testing helps to see these problems developing before they visibly manifest themselves. Huge amounts of money are being spent trying to fix these patches with products or practices that either don't work or make it worse. Even if someone is not trying to fix it, they may be putting down fertilizer and seed every year with the hope of getting something, only to be disappointed at harvest time. Now, digging deeper, literally, and doing proper tests will help you to diagnose and decide. And in this episode, I give an overview of how I approach this and why it's critical that you get solid advice from a certified crop advisor, a CCA, or a professional agrologist, which is a PAG designation, that truly understand the issue. Now, the first article that I'm going to lead with is called Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Agriculture. This isn't necessarily a new article, but I came across it while doing some other searching, and it turned out to be a great primer on the subject. Of note, in 1990, they calculate Canadian agriculture was putting more carbon in the ground than it was taking out. Now, this is likely due to the switch to no-till. However, they can't say agriculture was a net sink until the 2000s when land conversions slowed down enough. So this is great news, but there is a catch. We'll be at a steady state by 2040, meaning we're probably already at peak sequestration time now. This highlights something few seem to recognize. You can't just keep putting carbon in the soil. It's a cycle. Eventually, what goes in comes back out. And now to the article that I'm headlining this newsletter episode with. It's called How Do Cover Crops Impact Nitrous Oxide Emissions? In the previous article, if you read the entire resource, you'll find that all soils emit nitrous oxide. Special microbes that use nitrogen for energy let this go as a byproduct. In cool and wet conditions, more of these bacteria take over. When any vegetation, including cover crops, has been killed and is laying fresh on top of or in the soil, these little guys thrive. So a direct quote from the article, the primary driver of nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural soil is denitrification, which is promoted by wet soils, ample available mineral nitrogen, example nitrate, and the presence of carbon sources. and also freeze-thaw cycles. Cover crops influence each of these conditions. A 2014 meta-analysis found that cover crops decreased nitrous oxide emissions in 40% of the studies and increased them in the other 60%. And continuing on, a recent study in Ontario compared a 3-crop rotation with cover crops to a 2-crop rotation without cover crops. The researchers, led by Dr. Claudia Wagner-Riddle, uncovered that a 4-way cover crop mixture, which in this case was cereal rye, crimson clover, oats, and daikon radish, seeded after winter wheat, lowered emissions during the non-growing season relative to soybeans double. Now, the cover crop lowered soil nitrate in the fall and better insulated the soil against freeze-thaw events over the winter. However, nitrous oxide emissions in corn in the next growing season were higher, likely driven by carbon and nitrogen release from decomposing residues. So total emissions were greater with cover crops present. This article finishes with some recommendations for how to mitigate the effects. Unfortunately, there isn't much. Legumes seem to emit more, and even low biomass, in other words, not leaving a thick mat of decomposing biomass, didn't help either. They are studying inhibitors, the same ones used with fertilizer, to see the effect. So far, they can only say they show promise. Now, speaking of these inhibitors, the next article, called Treatments Cut N2O Emissions in Winter Wheat, looks at how they can benefit the environment in winter wheat production. In many systems, they don't pay, but in winter wheat, the nitrogen needs to be there for the fall and very early in the spring, which is prime times to lose nitrogen. However, a caution for those penciling out the economics. They drop emissions of nitrous oxide, but the total pounds of nitrogen lost is in the single digits. It rarely pays for a farmer to use them unless there is a financial incentive. Now, this episode isn't supposed to be a knock-on cover crops episode, but there is another problem with them. They are hard to make work in the prairies. The next article, called Cover Crops Pose Challenge for Prairie Farmers, looks at new research at how they could be interseeded with cash crops and survive the weed control sprays. Some of them are more tolerant than others, so they are hoping to find ones that are compatible with current systems. And a direct quote from the article, the team then studied weed pressure. The challenge was to find the sweet spot where weeds were controlled while keeping cover crops intact. We've got to find the Goldilocks treatment that balances the time and space for cover crops to grow with our cash crops, Lawley said, who's the prime researcher in this. And we need to find a cover crop that can best withstand weed treatments. Speaking of weeds, what do weeds tell us about soil? Have you heard that weeds can tell you what is lacking in your soil? I've heard this a lot, especially in organic circles. I've never heard it in academic talks. In a direct quote from this article, a review published in 1977 had this to say: "The information on weed indicator species is poorly documented, and much of it is residing only in the minds of observant farmers and gardeners." So to me, it sounds like reading weeds is as reliable as reading the tea leaves. Now, Robert Pavlis goes into this in much more detail, as he always does. I always love reading his articles because he does a lot of research. Now, while he's focusing in the gardening world, much of it applies to the farming world. The next article, what is the Climate Analogs Academy? Now, I recall when I was doing my master's degree in the early 2000s, there was talk of collaboration with Russian farmers that farmed in very similar areas of the prairies. Of course, we know that won't be happening now, but what if there were areas that you could tap into research that farmers in similar climatic conditions were doing? You might find out quicker what new things to try. This could work if you're looking at present day, or if you want to see what things look like if the climate change moves as fast as expected. The next one, the Fertilizer Institute awards biostimulant certification to Valent Biosciences. It's hard to tell if this is going to make a real difference or it's just a marketing scheme, but the idea of having biostimulants rated for efficacy could help bring some clarity to the market. In the very least, it should weed out the companies that are out there just to make a quick buck. And finally, this article, crushed glass replaces soil in this innovative approach to sustainable agriculture. Now, this raises a lot of red flags for me. What happens to these glass particles in root crops? Embedded foreign material is a huge food safety concern for potatoes and anything where we eat something that is dug from the soil. Once this is applied to the field, it's there forever, so you can't pull it out. It's just in the pilot phase, and it faces many barriers to commercialization, including cost and logistics. But still, I hope it's fully vetted before someone loses fields to production due to trying something innovative. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again